Okay, so as promised, I will help you understand this connection between the HPA axis, PTSD, really anything on the spectrum of PTSD, and the development of type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance. So, okay, what's the connection, Jen? You're saying? Um, First of all, something that you have to realize is that if you have a diagnosis of PTSD or complex PTSD or some kind of trauma history that puts you on this spectrum, then you have by default an increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes. Just one of the facts. So, given that, let me help you understand why that's the case and a little bit about what we can do about it, but that'll probably be more in future videos as to what we can do about it. So, you're under chronic stress. You have this diagnosis of PTSD, typically because you suffered some kind of trauma. Maybe it's childhood trauma. Alcoholic dad walked in the door, beats up on mom. You're the kid caught in the crossfire. This happens repeatedly. You don't know what to do. Right? So you're under fight or flight. You get triggered where massive levels of cortisol get shot out from your adrenals in response, right? So fight or flight is a response typically of the nervous system, but then what prolongs the response would be the endocrine system, because some of the time, historically, we have not been able to escape the bear in 30 seconds or less. And you don't want it pooping out, the whole system pooping out as you're trying to run away, right? You don't need to suddenly lose that energy that you had 30 seconds in, because I'm sorry, the ending is the same if the bear catches you 30 seconds in versus a minute in. So you need to get away. So given that we have this mechanism of response where the endocrine system kind of shifts in, and that's where cortisol gets secreted to maintain these effects that the nervous system did in order to help you escape the bear, right? So one of the effects of cortisol would be that it causes a dumping of blood sugar, into the blood, so that your skeletal muscles have the energy to run away from the bear. Now, other organs, the brain can grab the glucose, but really skeletal muscles and brain and heart are the ones that can get the energy. Everybody else kind of, oh, no, it's not for you. Leave it in the blood. Which in terms of stress, in the scenario we're talking about, somebody with PTSD, you end up chronically being subjected to high levels of cortisol and therefore high levels of glucose in the blood. Now, this is nearly identical to what happens in a type 2 diabetic. This is the recipe for how you develop it. So, that factor alone is going to increase your risk of developing type 2 diabetes. A second thing that happens would be in the whole scenario where you're perpetually having to secrete cortisol, the adrenals are doing this long term because you have such chronic stress, right? The HPA axis gets thrown off. And then the shutting down the whole system doesn't happen as readily. We can see things like the curve for cortisol getting shifted. Now, what am I talking about? Okay, so cortisol is not merely a stress hormone. It's actually a hormone that has a lot to do with our circadian rhythm. So typically in a normal scenario, a person has high levels of cortisol, that there's like a cortisol surge that happens kind of right before you wake up in the morning, an hour or so before you wake up. That surge goes, and then it kind of levels off over the course of the day, and such that it's low by the time you go to bed in the evening. The reason for that is it's part of what drives you out of bed in the morning, helps you get going. It's an amping up kind of hormone. So that curve can get shifted so that now all of a sudden the surge is not happening first thing in the morning. Maybe it got shifted backwards. And so now it's happening at night when you're trying to go to sleep. Well, that's going to have deleterious effects on your sleep, right? You're not going to be able to fall asleep, or you're going to fall asleep and then wake up too early. These kinds of scenarios happen. Now, what does that have to do with the development of type 2 diabetes, you say? Well, what happens is there is a correlation with sleep and insomnia, because what happens? Let's pretend the scenario, Jenn is not able to fall asleep. So what happens? Okay, I can't sleep. Well, I'm going to self-medicate. I'm going to do something to try to help myself fall asleep. Oh, I'll have some alcohol. Oh, wait, what is alcohol? Oh, another form of sugar. Okay, that's likely to contribute to the whole scenario, the whole snowballing thing that's going on. Secondly, what happens when I consume alcohol? Okay, it's 12:30 at night. I drank my glass, 2, 3, 4, however many of wine, and now I go to the fridge, and all of a sudden, my impulse control is down, right? Just very similar to the beer goggle effect that everybody talks about. Okay, you went in the bar and wait, did you sleep with her with beer goggles on? Right. Because your impulse control goes down, and all of a sudden you are doing things that you wouldn't typically decide to do in a non-intoxicated kind of state. So you go to the fridge, and the same thing happens with food. It's like beer goggles for refrigerator goggles. I don't know. You look in the fridge and you see the big chocolate cake left over from Jake's birthday party, and all of a sudden, it seems like a good idea to just get the fork and the cake and eat it right there with your wine, right? Classic. So this is, I don't need to tell you this, but this is furthering this situation with the development of type 2 diabetes, right? Sugar. Sugar leads to sugar. So then what happens? The more sugar you eat, folks, the more you crave sugar. If you want to see a change in how much sugar you crave, you just need to, if you get off it for a while, you will realize how sweet things like whole grain bread are. And suddenly you're going, whoa, it's almost too sweet. So that's another thing. Sugar ends up craving more sugar. It's addictive. There are addictive properties to it. That's not going to help the scenario. Another thing that's happening that's contributing to this whole PTSD, HPA axis dysfunction, and the development of type 2 diabetes would be the following. Hans Selye talked about this back in the 50s. Long-term chronic stress, one of the first things that happens is you get this hypercortisol state. You end up with high levels of cortisol that do all the stuff I told you. A second thing that, following that on the heels of that over time would be the same thing that happens with insulin resistance to the pancreas. The adrenals themselves get tired. They have difficulty perpetually shooting out the hormones that they're shooting out, namely cortisol and aldosterone, or even testosterone. You shoot out sex hormones from your adrenals as well. And so all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, I shouldn't say that. Now you have a drop in cortisol. So you can actually go from a hypercortisol state to a hypocortisol state, similar to something like Addison's disease, which, I mean, that's pretty bad. That's when you don't really make any hormones for the adrenals. But even in sort of just decreased levels, what happens with this? What do we see symptomology-wise? What we see is that you crave sugar and salt if aldosterone's gone. So what's that going to do? That's just going to further the whole scenario. You're going to crave more sugar, leading to more insulin, leading to this whole big ball of wax that's occurring, which further worsens the condition. Also, the low levels of BDNF that we see in the hippocampus that happen with the HPA axis getting thrown off in PTSD and trauma and all the stuff that's happening, also going to contribute to this problem. I mean, it's a constellation of stuff that happens. So that's more or less at least some of the connecting points, connect the dots, of why you see HPA axis dysfunction, PTSD, or things on the spectrum of trauma, and the development of type 2 diabetes. The good news is we know where the monster pops out of the bush at the end of the story. We can predict that, so we can be prepared for this. We can have the baseball bat ready to hit the monster over the head and not be subjected to his, I don't know, I don't watch horror flicks, guys, so, I mean, I just remember way back when I was maybe in 7th grade, because that was probably the last time I saw a horror flick, because I just decided I didn't really care for them much. Basically, we know the end of the story. We know how to predict. It's not just the music going no 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 no. However, the music leads to this anxious feeling. We know the end of the story, so we can adapt, and there are plenty of things in terms of diet, nutrition, and even the timing of eating as to how to affect this. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for tuning in, and I love the YouTube love. Keep it up. Subscriptions, likes, shares help get the word out about the channel. And we'll chat next time. Adios.